Hello, first period. It is Miss Elliott, your actual factual teacher, and today we're going to take notes on congruent figures. So to get started, we're going to define what we're talking about. What are congruent figures? Congruent figures are going to be shapes that have the exact same shape and size. Same shape, same size. Now, we've talked about things being congruent before. We've talked about congruent segments. We've talked about congruent angles. Now, a big difference is when we're talking about congruent figures is we're talking about shapes like triangles, rectangles, squares that are going to have a combination of segments and angles. And so all those little parts that match up and end up being the same size, those are corresponding parts. So a more specific definition of congruent figures are figures where their corresponding parts are congruent. And so, to define corresponding parts, one way you can define corresponding parts are the matching pairs. Matching pairs of sides and angles from one shape to the other. And one good way to identify the corresponding parts, they're going to be the parts that are marked congruent to each other. So let's not forget that congruent, this is a congruent symbol, and congruent means equal measure, same size, same shape. So then we get to our first example. This example here says, write a congruent statement for the triangles. Identify all pairs of congruent corresponding parts. So those parts can either be angles or sides. So before we get to our congruent statement, we're going to see what angles match up with each other. So if we start by looking at angle A, here's angle A. Go ahead and make it darker on your paper. It's a right angle, and it would be congruent to angle F, the one that's a right angle in the other triangle. Now let's look at angle B. It is marked with one arc. And if you look at the other triangle, angle G is marked with one arc. So angle B is congruent to angle G. And if we look at angle C, it's marked with two arcs. Angle C would be congruent to angle H. That is also marked with two arcs. So we looked at the angles. Let's look at the sides. So here, we're starting with AB. It has two tick marks. So I need to go to the other triangle and figure out what side has two tick marks. Well, that is side FG. Now let's look at this next side, side BC. BC is this side right here. and it's marked with 1, 2, 3 tick marks. To find what's corresponding, I need to look at the other triangle and find the side with 3 tick marks. So BC corresponds with GH, and is congruent to GH. And then our triangle has 3 sides, the last side being CA. CA is marked with 1 tick mark, and if I look at the other triangle, so is HF. So we've identified our corresponding parts. Let's now write our congruent statement. The diagram indicates that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle FGH. Whenever you're writing a congruent statement, order matters. So, if A comes first in your first triangle, you have to make the angle that is corresponding to A come first in your statement when you complete it. You have to match up the corresponding parts in the similar order. Order matters. Let's look at this congruent statement. We're given a picture and we're given a congruent statement. It says that QRST is congruent to WXYZ. So based on how this congruent statement is written, we can figure out a lot about what parts go with what. Angles are easier to figure out. So this figure has angle Q, R, S, and T. Let's list them out. Angle Q, angle R, angle S, and angle T. And all these parts are going to be congruent to parts in the other figure. And so I read it in order. Q goes with W. So angle Q is congruent to angle W. Angle R is congruent to angle X. Angle S is congruent to angle Y. And angle T is congruent to angle Z. You can figure all of this out without having your picture marked or without even having a picture. You can match up these points, which are the vertices of the angles in our figures. Now let's look at the sides. The sides are going to be a little bit more difficult. Let's start with QR. QR is going to be congruent. I took the first 2 points, so I'm going to take the first 2 points here. It's going to be congruent to WX. Let's go mark that on our picture. QR is congruent to WX. You mark with tick marks. Well, let's look at our next segment, RS. RS is going to be congruent to XY. And ST is going to be congruent to YZ. Let's mark these on our picture. RS is congruent to XY. I use 2 tick marks now because I've already used 1. Then we get to ST. ST is going to be congruent to YZ. Now those are just 3 of my sides. There's 4 sides. Well, the last pair of corresponding and congruent sides is TQ. It's congruent to ZW. And I'm going to mark those with 4 tick marks. So, We looked at our statement and we can make some conclusion about the parts of the figures. Now, if we look at these figures, you should notice that there's a bunch of numbers here, 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 and there's even variables, x and y. So how can we use this to solve and make conclusions? So how I want you to think about this is that if these parts are congruent, then what conclusions can we make? Well, starting with Q equals W. Well, if Q is 65 and they're congruent, then 65 is going to equal whatever W equals, which is 5x plus 5. This is an equation that we can and will solve for x later. All right, how can I use this next statement? Well, R is congruent to x. Well, R is 105 degrees, so angle X must equal 105 degrees. S is congruent to Y. Well, S is 120 degrees, so angle Y must also be 120 degrees because they're congruent. And we don't have any information on T and C. Now let's look at these sides. What can I conclude with the sides? QR is congruent to WX. So QR is 6 inches, and it must equal whatever WX equals because they are congruent. So here I've found some angle measures. I've even written some equations that we can solve for it. Let's go ahead and solve for X and Y. If we solve for X using this equation, subtract 5 on both sides, and you'll get that 60 equals 5x. Last step is going to be to divide both sides by 5, and x will equal 12. Well, I need to solve for y, but there's 2 variables. Good thing we just solved for one of them. 6 equals y minus, let's substitute in that 12. Now to solve for y, we're going to have to add 12 on both sides. And so y equals 18. So this is an example of how you can use congruent figures to solve problems. Last example on this page, and then we'll stop this video and start back up on the next page. So this question asks us, are the triangles congruent? How do you know? Write a congruent statement. Are the triangles congruent? Well, we're not sure yet. We need to check and see, are all the angles congruent? All the parts? All the sides congruent? Are all those parts congruent? So let's see what we can figure out. Starting with the angles, we can clearly see that angle D is congruent to angle H. They're both marked with one arc. Now let's look at this angle. Angle G is congruent to angle F. So far, I only have 2 angles that are congruent. But right here in the middle, you should notice something. That we have a pair of vertical angles. So we can say that angle E is congruent to angle E. Wait, that's not the best way to write it. Let's be more specific. Because it's not congruent to itself, it's congruent to its vertical angle. So this is an example where we have to use the full angle name. So angle DEG, this angle right here, is congruent to angle HEG.